Truth and Justice for German Society meeting. It's August 29th, 2020, and I'm Diane Chase, and I'm here with a pretty good group tonight. This, I think, is one of our larger ones for a while. And we even have Monica Schaefer here. She's actually in another part of BC, but she's here on Skype. And she's president of the Truth and Justice for German Society group. So I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. This is Frank Raymond. And Frank lives just outside of Vancouver, but he's in BC. And Frank is the author of Sweet Dreams and Terror Cells. And what I didn't tell Frank when I saw him this evening is that I have been reading his novel. And what I really enjoy about it is the discussion that the characters have about the white race, right? And the strengths of the white race. And that's what Frank often talks about. And I've seen his videos on Brian's show. If you look under the Truth and Justice for Germans playlist on the Brian Roos Show group, or Brian Roos Show.
BitChute channel.
BitChute channel. Thank you, Brian. And so tonight, let's listen to Frank Raymond. I do want to add a few other things too. Frank has done some debates here in Vancouver at the university. Is it
SFU,
Simon?
It's the symposium, the Capitalism and Morality Symposium.
Yes, and if you have a chance to look those up, I think you'll find them fascinating debates. So.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to once again address the Justice for German Society. And it's a pleasure long deferred, but time is of the essence. Justice for Germans, I say, is justice for the entire Caucasian race, because the attack that has lasted more than a century upon the white race, an attack that has reached a critical point, attacks the Germans in particular, but it attacks the entire white race. The fight of the Germans for truth is the fight of the entire white race. To understand that, you have to just see one thing. If a white man or woman stands up for the existence and prosperity and interests of white men and women, instantly they are called a Nazi German. True. So there is no difference here. The fight of Germans to regain their dignity is the fight for whites to maintain their very existence, to survive. Now, one has to ask, of course, why, but before that, I'll mention something. I grew up, part of my youth was spent in England, and the sustained propaganda against Germans, the vilification of Germans, was so intense that there was a very mild-mannered, once I was watching a European sports festival, and there was a very mild-mannered, very civilized English woman speaking, sitting with me, and in this game, it was just a game really, a sports event, and she said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't let the Germans win, don't let the wicked Germans win." And this is just a very civilized, gentle woman, and she speaks, "Don't let them win, don't let the wicked Germans win." I went to school, at a boarding school in England, and we had jokes. And jokes, of course, reflect what people hear in the popular culture. And one day this person someone told a joke that there was a German concentration camp commandant, and he addressed the prisoners and said, "Today we have some good news and we have some bad news. The good news, you will be transferred out of this hellhole. Half of you will go to Dortmund, the other half to Essen. And now the bad news. The top half of you will go to Dortmund, the bottom half to Essen." The top half of the prisoners, that is. will go to one town and the bottom half will be cut off and will be sent to another town. Now that was the sort of spirit, the impression people have of Germans, and in particular of National Socialist Germans. And that tells you a bit about the intensity of the vilification, of the slander upon the German people. But you wonder why. In fact, they try to say it's not just a few wicked Germans here and there, they say it's all of them. It is in the character of the Germans that they will be so. And there has been an attempt to make this. For example, the Adolf Eichmann went on trial in Jerusalem. It was a show trial. And a book was written by a woman named Hannah Arendt, A-R-E-N-D-T, Hannah Arendt. And the title of the book was The Banality of Evil. That Eichmann represents supreme evil, the devil with horns, the devil with a black tail. And yet he's so banal, he looks so normal, ordinary, like the German who might sit beside you on the bus. The videos produced, I think, by the US Holocaust Memorial Foundation, to that effect. Why did ordinary Germans go along with this? So there's an effort to say that every German, including the ordinary Germans, are evil. Every one of them wants to grab hold of some Jew or gypsy and shove them into a blazing oven. Now, why the Germans in particular? As I said, the attack is upon the entire white race, but why the Germans in particular? Well, I think it's because the Germans represent the best of the Caucasian race. And I'll explain what that means. It was the intention of the Bolsheviks, if you like, the Jew Bolsheviks, to not only enslave the Russian and Ukrainian people with communism, Bolshevism, whatever you care to call it, but to debase them, to turn them into proles, to turn them into trash, a nation of slaves and whores. To make a prole out of a person is to see that he's so vulgar, so faithless, a man lacking in integrity, in friendships, faith, loyalty. He'll sell out his own grandmother for 10 cents. That's the type of person. And of course, there are such people right now in Western society. They would betray their best friend to steal their welfare check, or to get even 10 cents out of them. I've seen it happen. That's what debasement does. And of course, the effort is to make people unnatural, everything that is unnatural. Instead of the normal birth, you have in vitro births, women carrying other people's babies. You have transsexuals being promoted. Every kind of debasement is promoted in an effort to turn people into proles. But above all, they wanted to debase the character of the whites and make them shiftless, lazy, insincere, and above all, beggars, always with their hand out to the commissar. Please give me this allotment, please give me this extra entitlement, this check, and go down on your knees before the commissar. Now, that is the opposite of the Caucasian character. And who says so? Not me. It is the people who hate the Caucasians who say so. Now, recently, you might know that the Smithsonian Institution or Foundation published an article on whiteness, on terrible things about whites and whiteness. Terrible things like punctuality, conscientiousness, industriousness, attention to detail, a determination to get the job done. These are the terrible aspects of what they call whiteness. And then, today we are speaking on the 29th August 2020, just 10 days ago, or so, about 10 days ago, a foundation called an institution called Scandia, which I believe makes nuclear weapons. They sent their white male executives to an indoctrination session or a debasement session where they were supposed to get down on their knees and grovel, and they're supposed to write down and renounce the sins of punctuality, industry, assiduousness, attention to detail. These are the terrible sins of the white male, you see. and they have to repent and say we're going to give up all these. Now, Tucker Carlson on Tucker Carlson Tonight on Fox News exposed this to a national audience, that this is what they're trying to teach into whites. Forget all your good virtues. Become proles, become beggars, become handout-seeking, shiftless, lazy welfare bums. Now, it's hard to believe. 10 years ago, no one would have believed that this would be so. But now they're saying that these are the qualities of the whites that make them arrogant and proud and supremacist. They must wipe out all that is good, especially industriousness. Now, who has this quality, these white qualities the most? Well, it's the Germans. I once, in the course of learning to speak German, I decided I'd go to a German, well, I was invited to try out the German choir of Vancouver. Well, I arrived 3 minutes late. And they chewed me out for that and had a long talk with me later on saying, well, you know, you said you were interested, but then you arrived late. Now, all white peoples, especially the English particularly, they really don't like lateness. Tardiness is a great sin. They say it's disrespect to the other people. If you say you're going to a party and you go late, you're disrespecting the other party. And this is a very white quality. I can tell you in India, no one cares too much about being punctual. In fact, sometimes people don't even go to appointments. If they don't feel like it, they just don't go, and they don't inform the other side that, oh, I won't be there. And that's something we don't like about ourselves in India, that we are that irresponsible. But a white quality is commitment to others, respect for others, respect for the external, is a very white quality, and the Germans have it in high degree. Industriousness, that is creative work, as opposed to flipping houses, speculating on the stock market, playing little games known as financial instruments. That the Germans are very much opposed to that. They are people who have always prospered because they do creative work. Though Germany was destroyed after the Second World War, sort of building by building, destroyed down to the grassroots, they came right back up, and despite being milked in many ways, they are still the most prosperous society in Europe because they believe in creative work. And this is something Adolf Hitler himself repeatedly stressed, that the Aryan has the virtue of creative work, and this national society, socialist society we will build, will give precedence to work and to producing goods. Lotteries don't produce goods. Human hands and effort do. Ingenuity produces prosperity. So these are the qualities that Germans have to a high degree, which explains their enduring success. And that is why I think the enemies of the white race are so anxious to vilify, debase and destroy the Germans, because they represent the best of the Caucasian race. And that is why today they say that even the ordinary white, not a certain stockbroker, not a certain captain of industry, every white is evil and has these qualities of whiteness. That's what you hear on the television screens and the universities all the time. In a similar way, there's been efforts to say every German is evil. He may be banal, banality, normal, the guy on the bus, the guy who adjusts his glasses. But no, he's a torturer and concentration camp chief at heart. So, it is now a part of of the mainstream white person to think of Germans as having started the Second World War and have perpetrated massive crimes upon the Jews. It's hardwired into them. So, in order to have people get a glimmering of the truth, to understand their history, to understand what really happened, it's necessary to, in a way, deprogram these people, to open their eyes, to red pill them, to get them to start asking questions. But you can't just tell them that, oh no, I researched it and I found out this. I found out that, oh, the Jews weren't totally innocent. There was a whole group of Jews who were Bolsheviks. And they enslaved and terrorized the entire Soviet Union and perhaps killed 65 million people. If you tell them that, it doesn't make any difference. It is necessary to get them to ask questions, to get them to be curious, and that's what I'll focus this talk on. What are the questions that one asks to get someone to begin to inquire, to become curious, to become skeptical? How do you get a liberal, a lemming, to think? Because a lemming's instinct is not to think, the lemming's instinct is to follow the other lemmings. How do you get a lemming to stop for a moment and stop following? Well, you could ask some questions and say, you've said this to me, and you've heard it, you've seen it on, say, a TV series called War and Remembrance, or another TV series called The Winds of War. You've got all these impressions, but well, maybe you'd like to explain something to me. So why, for example, would the National Socialists and Hitler and the Germans, why would they persecute the Jews? What for? And the answer to you is, there was a murderous hatred. There was a murderous hatred. It was an irrational and insane hatred, because that is what anti-Semitism is called. An irrational, ill-founded, and pathological hatred. Irrational, pathological hatred. Just think about that. And they say, well, how did the Germans suddenly get it? The Jews had lived among them forever. And they'll say, well, Hitler indoctrinated them. Some Jewish prostitute gave him syphilis or gonorrhea in some cheap brothel, in some alley, or some Jewish peddler cheated him on some side street. And he got this pathological hatred, and then he passed it on to the Germans. By some magical process, this one man was able to indoctrinate them all and turn them into hate machines. Well, and then they'll say, well, they seized upon the Jews as a scapegoat. Germany had lost the war, they had raging inflation, people were dying of hunger, they needed a scapegoat. Well, it's a bit of news to me that anyone needs a scapegoat. I once failed an exam, a critical exam. I didn't look around for a scapegoat. I tried to do the best and make the best of my life after that. But that's what they say. They needed a scapegoat, and they seized upon the Jews as a scapegoat. And then I met a teacher once who'd been to a teachers' conference, and they'd been shown a film about Germany and National Socialism, and they said how the Germans were so pathologically hateful of the Jews, and I said, why? Well, they thought of them as rats. They thought they were less than human. Well, that's a strange one, but I suppose I can believe, if I can believe that, I can believe anything. Another reason for this murderous hatred is that the Jews were an inferior race. So the Germans said, don't even intermarry with the Jews, they're inferior. Well, the last I heard, the National Socialists and Hitler thought of them as supremely able, malevolent, and cunning, far from inferior. But that's what they say. And lastly, the explanation is why this murderous hatred. Religion, the Jews killed Christ, and the Christians have always hated the Jews. So these are the explanations given. Murderous hatred, and these are the elements of it. Fair enough. But then a little question arises, which I would raise to any liberal. What about the Poles? Well, the Poles, the Germans invaded Poland and had a pretty ruthless occupation. Well, what about the Poles? Didn't I see in Schindler's List now, there's a part in which the Germans are moving the Jews out of some city quarter, and the Polish people are throwing stones at the Jews. And there's a Polish girl, particularly ugly, shouting, "Goodbye, Jews! Goodbye, Jews!" And people are throwing stones and objects at the Jews. How is it that Steven Spielberg was so anxious to portray the Poles as anti-Semitic, as full of irrational, pathological hatred? These Schindler's workers, these Jewish workers, are in a train, and the train, by some mistake or bureaucratic malfunction, is headed for Auschwitz. As they near Auschwitz, a fat Polish boy, well-fed and fat, is outside there, and he draws his finger across his throat to indicate to the Jews that you're going to get your throats cut. And of course, this begins to get them for the first time worried. We're on this train and this fellow's saying we'll get our throats cut. But the fat boy is grinning as he does it, so, you know, these Poles are really full of hatred. In the TV serial The Winds of War, starring Ali McGraw, I think that was her name, Ali McGraw, a very famous TV miniseries. There is very good Polski and very bad Polski. This is very bad Polski, says the Jewish uncle of Ali McGraw. And I also see this book here, an interesting book. It's called The Holocaust Chronicle. And it's published by this, it's an immense piece of work published by Louis Weber, CEO, Publications International, in Lincolnwood, Illinois. It's a huge book, as you can see. Normally costs about $70, wasn't selling. I got it for the discount price of $15. And this book has some interesting stuff. One part of it about Poland. There is an illustration of what the Poles, of a poster that the Poles made of an evil-looking Jewish figure. And it's this poster from Poland, I'm reading from the book now. This poster from Poland seeks to link Jews with communism and big capital. The caption reads, "Plutocracy or Bolshevism, both are invented by Jews." Another poster, this time in red, with a diabolical Jewish figure with the Star of David on his chest. And this poster, the caption from the book reads, "This poster reflects the anti-Semitism of the Polish organization Obóz Narodowo-Radykalny, National Radical Camp. It asserts that Jews are the whip, brackets oppressors, of all mankind. Founded in April 1934, the National Radical Camp was banned by Polish leader Józef Pilsudski 3 months later. So, it seems that the Poles had somebody to blame for raging inflation and they were seeking a scapegoat. Now, forgetting about the Poles, what about the Ukrainians? The Ukrainians now, everyone seems to have a problem with the Ukrainians. Now, I wonder if people have seen the film, the vast film, Holocaust, Story of the Family Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, Holocaust, Story of the Family Weiss, starring Meryl Streep, Michael Moriarty, and other such luminaries. This is a movie that is gut-wrenching. If anyone doubts that the Germans are monsters in human form, just see that movie. It will show them engaged in every kind of greed, depravity, sadism, torture, and cruelty. For example, they not only flogged this Jewish artist, a soldier is ordered to break his hands so that he doesn't paint again, and he goes into his cell and smashes his hand with a hammer. The cruelties are legion in that movie, which represents the Germans to be this kind of depraved monster. And Meryl Streep is the wife of one of the chief characters, a Jewish artist. But in that, one of the boys, one of the brothers has escaped to Russia. He joins partisans, which means communist, Jewish communist guerrilla unit. And they see in a field, the wide steppes of Ukraine, a column of uniformed people coming, and they say, "Ukrainian militia, Ukrainian militia, these, we must ambush them and kill them all." Well, one of them manages to escape, and this boy, Rudy, this is the youngest brother of the family Weiss, he manages to pursue him and capture him, but at the last moment he can't shoot him. He's so full of the milk of human kindness that he can't shoot this Ukrainian militia boy. And one of the other guerrilla people, his chief, comes and machine guns him and says, this is the type of Ukrainian who kills Jews. Do not hesitate to kill them." So the Ukrainians are another bunch of disgusting anti-Semites. In fact, every so often the Holocaust lobby hauls up some Ukrainian guard from some camp and says, put him on trial. He's Ivan the Terrible or whatever. What was the name of that man? John Demaniuk? Demaniuk.
He was innocent, he never did it.
Well, but Ukrainians are definitely accused of vicious anti-Semitism. Let me try and find an article from here, from this book, page 447, and see what they have to say. Ah, yes. This is interesting. They show a picture of two Ukrainian soldiers with long rifles, and they are fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto. The caption reads, Ukrainian SS soldiers, that is SS meaning the German Schutzstaffel, the dreaded SS as they call it, Ukrainian SS soldiers examine the bodies of Jews at the entrance to a destroyed apartment house in the Warsaw Ghetto. Auxiliary units from the Ukraine provided crucial manpower that was necessary to implement the Nazis' genocidal campaigns. The Ukrainian units were renowned for their brutal efficiency. So it seems there's another gang of irrational pathological haters, another nation, the Ukrainians. Now, we continue. What about the Hungarians? Well, there's just no end to the bestiality of the Hungarians. For example, you might watch the film Hannah's War, Hannah being spelled H-A-N-N-A, Hannah's War, which was played over and over on every channel on TV up to a few years ago, in which this girl from a very wealthy Budapest Jewish family was going to go to Israel, but then joined some Jewish group for some mission in Hungary. She was captured, and there the Hungarians were the most brutal, sadistic people. The Hungarian secret police chief, acted by Donald Pleasance, was always sniggering and grinning and set up a torture chamber for her, and they put her through the most brutal treatment. And the Hungarians in general were anti-Semites of the first order. Every year we are reminded that the Hungarians deported almost all of the Jewish population of Hungary to Germany. They say to Auschwitz, that's what they say. And every year Jewish groups go to Budapest and place shoes against the river Danube, against the banks of the river Danube, to symbolize the millions of Hungarian Jews who were deported and killed. So they have a cartoon here published by the Hungarians with a Jewish, very fat Jewish plutocratic capitalist, bloated, grinning over poor Hungarians. And the caption reads, promoting the caricature of the Jew as puppet master, this cartoon from a Budapest, Hungary anti-Semitic publication played on people's fears and animosities. The rich Jew is pictured as manipulating all society. Under racist Prime Minister Gisela Gombos, who controlled the government from 1932 to 1939, in May 1938, Hungary, following the German example, enacted a law restricting Jewish participation in the country's economic life. So, in Hungary, it seems they regarded the Jew capitalists as puppet masters. Okay? And we could go on in that vein. The Slovaks are also depicted in that way. Because time being short, I'll not take a citation from the book. But it happens that the Slovaks had a problem with Jewish terrorists, and they actually paid the Germans to take Jews to camps in Germany. And the Germans were reluctant. They said, we're going to pay you this money, but We don't even know if they're going to work properly. Now, there was a video on YouTube on the subject, and one man said, well, I was happy in a way that the Jews were being deported because then the trouble would stop. And there, not only the trouble stopped, the video stopped. He was cut off right then and there. No more explanation of what trouble would stop or what kind of trouble the Jews were making. But I did a little research. There was considerable terrorism by the Jews in Slovakia. Slovak government paid the Germans to take the Jews. Actually paid them per head. Romanians, they are said to be so anti-Semitic at that time that there's a video on YouTube saying Romania so efficient at Holocausting Jews that the Germans had to learn from them. They set an example, a model. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, there's well documented. There's a series produced, I believe, by the BBC called Nazi Collaborators, in which they talk about Leon de Grelle, the Belgian collaborator, Anton Musak, I think his name was, the Dutch collaborator, Pierre Laval, the French prime minister who collaborated with the Germans, and so forth. And they go into depth about Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. In particular, I think it was Herbert Sukurs, C-U-K-U-R-S. Now, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that he was a Lithuanian. It shows that they took the Lithuanians, not the Germans. After the Germans invaded in 1941, the Bolsheviks fled. And the Bolsheviks, the Baltic peoples all said the Bolsheviks were Jews. Jewish commissars, Jewish secret police. Well, they fled, and these peoples turned on their former oppressors, sometimes within a day, within the hour, in fact. Now, one of them was this Herbert Sukurs, and it says that under his leadership, the Lithuanians, not the Germans, the Lithuanians, took a whole bunch of Jews to a forest and murdered them, executed them. And the explanation that the BBC gave, why would the Lithuanians be so furious against the Jews? The explanation the BBC gave was that Sukurs said, today Jews must die. Today Jews must die. That's the explanation given. No other background needed. He's just a pathological, irrational hater. In Latvia, watch the same picture. There's a very famous video which is shown over and over of German soldiers herding a bunch of people in uniforms, running them along, putting them up against a trench, shooting them, and then one man wasn't quite dead. The German soldier used a pistol to finish him off. That is shown over and over as one of the few pictures taken, in fact, by that film was taken by a German sailor. A German sailor took that film. What they don't mention is that all those people were secret policemen, guilty of torture and murder of every sort, who were handed over by the Latvians. The Germans didn't have to round them up, the Latvians handed them over. Here are the criminals who have been torturing and killing us. About Estonia, there's numerous attempted prosecutions, especially in Australia, that this man is living free in Australia after having participated in the Holocaust, and somehow they don't mention exactly why. Why would the Estonians be so furious? Why would they participate in... I listen sometimes to the accounts, the testimonies as they call it, of Holocaust survivors, made by various universities. So one was made, I believe, by a project sponsored by Steven Spielberg. And here's this woman saying that we saw that after the German troops entered, in a day the Germans and the Estonians became brothers, and they cooperated in rounding us up and hauling us off to camps. Now she was asked, why would the Estonians do that? And she said, well, I guess they just hated us. It's religion. It's a religious thing. We have always been hated because Christians hate the Jews, you know. Now, the Russians are not left out of this, of course. One has only to watch the movie Fiddler on the Roof. All this wonderful Jewish family among in a Jewish community deep in Russia, singing, dancing, falling in love, laughing at each other, and it's all ruined when the wicked Russians come in and send them all packing at gunpoint. And of course there's times when they've shown the Russians are hostile. The actor Topol, the chief actor, he says, these are the others in our village. So far they have left us alone. But one day a Russian official comes and orders them to kick the Jews out of their houses and send them off to Siberia or whatever. So the Russians are also filled with this pathological hatred. Now, one has to ask, I wouldn't want to forget the US, which is not left out. There are numerous films and documentaries that Americans suffered from a vicious anti-Semitism, and of course at one time in the 30s, after the Germans were told the Jews, you have to leave Germany, you have to leave us in peace. You're a dangerous element, you have caused much harm. Leave, emigrate now. At that time, 2 ships full of Jewish refugees were coming to America. I think one of them is called the St. Louis or something. But America turned them away. And there's endless condemnation of the Americans as being anti-Semitic in spirit. You know, it's just deep within them. So they turned them away, and Canada was requested to take Jewish refugees. The Canadian Prime Minister in the 30s, I'm trying to remember his name, he gave the answer through his spokesman. When they asked, how many Jews will you take into Canada? His answer through his spokesman was, none is too many. And every year I'm regaled to that by the National Post, the infamous attitude of the then Canadian Prime Minister, none is too many, that vicious anti-Semitism which... And then let us not forget the Catholic Church. Is a strange thing, but after the war, when the National Socialist leadership needed to escape, either escape or be tortured, beaten, put on show trials, but torture was certainly one of the biggest fears of any National Socialist. The Nuremberg trials were hellholes of torture. Prisoners, an American commission headed by the 2 Supreme Court justices, Simpson and Van Roden, found that they examined over 50 German prisoners and found all of them had been kicked in the testicles with steel-toed boots, and their testicles were beyond repair. So of course Germans were anxious to flee, and guess who helped them? The Catholic Church. The entire, what they call the rat line, the escape of these Germans to South America, was assisted by Catholic priests, cardinals, using the churches and monasteries and refuges that the Catholic Church operated. In fact, that's how one of them got caught when, in France, I think, they were tapping the phone lines of one of the Catholic cardinals. And that's how they heard that they are helping this particular German to escape. Now, one would have to ask, why would the Catholic Church be so anti-Semitic? One would have to ask. Now, I can tell you the answer. The Jew Bolshevik treatment of the church was brutal. They turned churches into distilleries and pigsties, and their hatred of the priests was particularly harsh. In some cases, the priests they would tear out the intestines of a priest and make him run round and round a pole, wrapping his intestines around the pole as they whipped him to make sure he kept running around the pole. The treatment of Catholic priests, of Christian priests was brutal, because the Christian priest And the Christian code spoke of morality, of not stealing, of not molesting your neighbor's wife, of keeping your word. And of course, the object of the Bolsheviks was to rip people of all human decency and morality, to turn them into proles, into slaves and scum. And they could not afford a Christian code that told people to be honorable. And this was promoted by a man called Georg Lukács, Georg Lukacs. He was the kind of pioneer of what they call cultural terrorism. And you see a variant of that cultural terrorism, that drive to turn people into proles, you can see happening today, starting in the 60s, when certain people promoted the commune, the hippie commune, where men and women slept on mattresses, and you could just move to the next mattress and slept with the woman. At the end of it, they'd say, I don't know whose child that is. This is the child of 100 fathers. So he's the child of all of us. So the child didn't have the support system of a family, a lineage and an ancestry. You see that today with cultural terrorism is what Georg Lukács called it. Cultural terrorism. And of course you see cultural terrorism today when kids are told that there are 40 genders. Okay, there's no male and female, no such thing. There are 40 genders and none of them is male or female. That when they promote, not just tolerate, but promote homosexuality and say that the homosexual marriage is equivalent to a heterosexual marriage. How can that be? A heterosexual marriage produces children and perpetuates the race. Okay? The cultural terrorism of the Bolsheviks is being done today, but not with the guns of the secret police, not yet. So, no wonder the Catholic Church was so anxious to help the National Socialists, whom they regarded as a bulwark against the terrible danger of Jewish communism. So, what is the issue here? If people say that the entire Holocaust, and in fact the Second World War as a whole, was the result of the murderous hatred of Hitler, the National Socialists and the Germans, and they say it was due to many things. It was due to many things. It was due to, they blamed the Jews for the loss of the war, the First World War, for the raging inflation, for spreading disease, whatever. Then one has to ask, what about all these people, the Hungarians, the Russians, the Poles? Every one of them has been indicted as suffering from irrational and pathological hatred of the Jews. So did they also need a scapegoat for some economic crisis? Did they also suddenly remember after thousands of years that yes, the Jews killed Christ? Did they also say, oh yes, the Jews are rats, less than human? Did they also have a leader who magically indoctrinated them one day, just as Hitler indoctrinated the Germans? I would ask a liberal to answer that question. Are the Estonians, Romanians, Russians, Latvians, Lithuanians, you've told me up to now that the Germans were uniquely anti-Semitic, uniquely evil, suddenly plunged into barbarism, but what about all these other people? Okay? What about the Estonian and Latvian units that shot Jews in trenches in huge numbers? Are these entire nations consumed by an irrational and pathological hatred? Now that's a terrible accusation to level against any one nation, but to level them against practically the entire white race is quite something. That they're all insane. It's an accusation of insanity. They did these things out of insanity. They suddenly turned on us out of insanity. They're pathological and irrational hatred. Now, there was a man here in the northwest of the US named Ted Bundy. He was a mass murderer. He killed 20, 30 people. He kidnapped children and tortured them, I believe. He was a terrible man. But if, on trial, Ted Bundy had said that, look, it's not, the problem here is not me. The problem is that you're accusing me of these things because you have a pathological and irrational hatred of me. Now, I wouldn't accept that from Ted Bundy. Why would I accept that from the Jew Bolsheviks? Okay? I have to say, what did you do to merit the fact that all these people turned on you? Okay? I can't believe the explanations given. The explanations given are things like, in the Baltic states, the Germans instantly, upon invading the country, upon invading these countries, they started a vicious propaganda campaign against the Jews, and the Baltic peoples rose up against the Jews. Well, gee, I've seen the films in which the German units have entered Riga, entered Tallinna, and within 30 minutes, the people started burning the synagogues and rounding up the leading Jewish collaborators with the communist secret police. Now, did this propaganda campaign convince them in 30 minutes? There's the biggest documentary on the Second World War is called Apocalypse. It's a huge documentary in 10 parts or so. Apocalypse, World War II Apocalypse, in which they say that local anti-Semites blamed the Jews for the excesses of the communists, and they turned on the Jewish communities. Well, a local anti-Semite, that's a man in Russia who has a pathological, irrational hatred. He's insane, in fact. So all these Russians were insane. They just blamed the Jews for the excesses of communism. Okay? Is that credible? So, I would ask any liberal to say that, okay, you've said so far the Germans are the vicious people, they are the ones who inflicted the Holocaust. Explain to me all these peoples and then tell me they're all insane. Are they? So, next thing I hear about is that the problem with the Second World War is that Hitler and the Germans wanted to rule the world. And of course they had to be stopped. They had to be stopped by idealistic people who know that ruling the world is a bad thing. Well, who were these idealistic people? Well, there was the British Empire led by Winston Churchill, and there was America led by President Roosevelt, and then there were the traditional governments of Holland and France. There was a French government in exile, which still held the French colonies. There was a Dutch government in exile, which still ruled the Dutch East Indies, along with a few other possessions. Now, didn't these people rule the world? So, for example, the French ruled most of North Africa, the French Cameroons, Indochina. The Dutch continued to rule Indonesia until the Japanese invaded and booted them out, that is. But they continued. They were running Indonesia as they had run for 200 years and exploiting it for 200 years. And then the British sought to paint the map red. They wanted to, the red meant the British Empire on maps, India, Nigeria, Kenya, all in red. The British ruled over a quarter of the world and had no intention of giving it up. So these were the idealists who said that ruling the world is a bad thing. Am I to believe that out of idealism they went to stop the Germans? These people who were so anxious to, who ruled the world and had no intention of giving it up. Then they say, well, another problem with the Second World War was really the Germans are out to acquire new territory. Hitler wanted to acquire territory in the East. I don't deny that he wrote, certainly he wrote it and it was a long-term plan that if Germans occupied the territory up to the Urals, they would they would have what he called living space, and the world would be a better place if Germans had those resources. Now, Roosevelt, for example, said that was a terrible thing. But was it not true that Roosevelt ran the United States, which had acquired living space, booting out Red Indians from all over the place, and even territories, parts of America were acquired newly just prior to the 1930s. There were parts of America that were parts of Texas and the Southwest that were very recently acquired. So these peoples, the Americans, had acquired huge living space, and they regard it as a necessity for a prosperous economy. Canadians, a tiny population of Anglo-Celtics, had acquired a huge territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And they had done it successfully. In Australia, a mainly British colony, they'd taken a whole continent, saying we need living space, we need these resources. Only a large territory guarantees safety, prosperity, security. And so was it so in those times, in the 1930s, was it so surprising that Hitler would say for the long-term future of Germans, we must have an equally large territory? It's not surprising. But if these peoples were sincere, why didn't they just give up their territories and say, Hitler, you're doing something wrong. Acquiring large territories from other people, living space, is a very bad thing. We are going to set an example and give it up ourselves. But no one did. So I don't see that as uniquely evil. Not in the context of those times. Those were times of imperial expansion. And just going back to the last point, I'll say that the accusation of insanity, of pathological and irrational hatred, has been leveled not just against whites, but against the Arabs and the Muslims in the last 30 years. So there's this problem with all these hateful people, Iranians, Iraqis, they're all hateful people. They're full of hatred, and the trouble with the Palestinians is not that they're occupied, but that they hate the Jews. That's been said many times, that they teach their children to hate the Jews, and that's the problem, not the fact that we are booting them out of their farms and starving them of water. The problem is their hatred. So it's not just the whites who get this accusation.